No cameras caught it. No microphones recorded it. But inside a private royal gathering meant to celebrate unity, a single word, or rather the refusal to say it, changed everything. When Prince George was gently prompted to address Queen Camilla as Grandma, he didn't hesitate. He didn't stumble. He simply refused. The room went silent. And what followed sent a quiet tremor through the monarchy that still hasn't settled. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It was supposed to be a moment of warmth, the kind the palace quietly encourages behind closed doors to reinforce the image of harmony. A gathering without press, without ceremony, without expectation beyond polite smiles and rehearsed normalcy. Yet the intimacy of the setting only magnified the weight of what happened next. When the word did not come, it wasn't awkwardness that filled the air, it was recognition. Senior figures understood instantly that this silence carried intention. This was not a child forgetting a cue. This was a choice. The reaction was immediate, though restrained. A slight tightening of posture. A glance exchanged between advisors. Someone attempted to redirect the conversation, to smooth the moment before it hardened into memory. But it was too late. The absence of that single word had already spoken louder than any correction could. Because children do not refuse lightly, especially children raised inside an institution built on obedience, symbolism, and emotional discipline. What unsettled those present most was not the refusal itself, but the calm certainty behind it. Prince George did not fidget. He did not look to his parents for reassurance. He remained composed, almost solemn, as if he had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. That composure suggested something far deeper than defiance. It hinted at understanding, at an emotional conclusion already reached. In that silence, the adults were forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility. This decision had been forming quietly, shaped by moments no one had thought significant enough to notice. Conversations overheard. Absences felt. Emotional boundaries sensed but never explained. The kind of invisible weight children carry when they are expected to adapt without being asked how they feel. What made the moment truly destabilizing was the realization that it could not be corrected without making it worse. To insist would be to expose the emotional fault line running beneath the surface. To ignore it would be to admit it existed. Either way, the palace was suddenly facing something it rarely allows space for: authentic feeling. Unfiltered and unscripted. And as the gathering moved on, as voices lowered and laughter returned in fragments, one truth lingered unspoken in the room. This refusal was not an isolated incident. It was not spontaneous. It was not impulsive. It was the quiet culmination of something that had been building for far longer than anyone was prepared to acknowledge. What no one in that room realized was that this refusal didn't begin that day. It was the final expression of a much deeper, unspoken fracture. Prince George is often described as polite, composed, and unusually observant for his age. But what happens when a child raised inside the world's most scrutinized family starts noticing patterns the adults refuse to acknowledge? Long before the word grandma became an issue, George had begun asking questions, quiet ones, uncomfortable ones, about absence, loyalty, and why certain names were spoken with tension instead of warmth. From an early age, George learned how to listen without appearing to. In a household where words were measured and emotions carefully contained, he became attuned to what wasn't said. He noticed how conversations shifted when certain people entered a room, how laughter softened, how voices lowered, how topics changed without explanation. To adults, these adjustments were instinctive. To a child, they were clues. And George collected them patiently, without interruption, without judgment. There were moments that stayed with him. Family gatherings where affection felt formal rather than natural. Hugs that came with pauses. Smiles that arrived late. He noticed how warmth seemed selective. How closeness appeared governed by invisible rules he was never taught, but somehow expected to follow. For George, this inconsistency created confusion. Children do not rationalize emotional distance the way adults do. They feel it. They absorb it. And when it repeats, they begin to wonder why. What made this particularly heavy was George's heightened sensitivity. He wasn't simply observing behavior. He was feeling its emotional residue. He sensed when tension lingered after conversations ended. He recognized when a name caused discomfort rather than familiarity. And slowly, he began associating certain roles not with love, but with restraint. Not with safety, but with careful distance. These impressions formed quietly, without confrontation, settling into his understanding of family long before anyone realized it was happening. Inconsistencies became impossible for him to ignore. Why were some relationships spoken of with reverence, while others were discussed only in practical terms? Why did certain absences feel permanent, while new presences were introduced as obligations rather than choices? George didn't have the language to articulate these questions, but he carried them nonetheless. Each unanswered moment added weight, shaping an inner narrative no one else could see. Most telling were the subtle signs of internalized loss. A quiet withdrawal during conversations about family history. A thoughtful pause when certain traditions were mentioned. A seriousness that seemed beyond his years. These were not acts of rebellion or sadness, but evidence of a child trying to reconcile emotional truth with the version of reality presented to him. And the more he observed, the more he realized that something essential was missing, something that could not be replaced simply by assigning a title or encouraging affection. And the deeper he observed, the more one absence began to overshadow everything else. For Prince George, the word grandma was never abstract. It already belonged to someone else. Someone whose presence lingered in photographs, stories, and whispered reverence. Someone whose legacy filled rooms even after she was gone. And as the palace quietly encouraged George to transfer that title to another woman, the child began to feel something no one had prepared him for: betrayal, wrapped in expectation. From the beginning, Queen Elizabeth II was not introduced to George as a distant historical figure or a ceremonial monarch. She was spoken about as constancy itself, as reassurance, as the calm center around which everything else revolved. Her name was said softly, carefully, with a respect that bordered on devotion. Even in her absence, she remained present, framed not just in portraits, but in the tone of family conversations, in the way traditions were defended, in the reverence that followed any mention of her choices. For George, legacy was not an abstract concept taught through duty. It was emotional inheritance. He learned who she was through stories meant to preserve her spirit, not her power. Through moments when adults paused before speaking her name, as if afraid of diminishing it. Through rituals that felt less like obligation and more like remembrance. And somewhere along the way, Grandma became inseparable from that memory. It was not a role. It was a bond. That is why the suggestion unsettled him so deeply. The idea that a title so heavy with love and meaning could simply be reassigned felt wrong in a way he could not immediately explain. Children do not compartmentalize grief the way adults do. They do not replace what is lost by filling the space quickly. They sit with it. They guard it. And when they sense that something sacred is being treated as transferable, they feel the loss all over again. What made this conflict even more painful was the pressure of duty woven quietly into the request. George understood, even at his age, that expectations followed him everywhere. That certain words mattered. That harmony was something he was meant to help project. But this was different. This wasn't about protocol or politeness. It was about loyalty to memory, to feeling, to the version of love he had been taught was irreplaceable. Inside him, two forces collided. One urging him to comply, to make things easier, to fit into the version of family unity presented to him. The other urging him to protect something fragile and personal, something that belonged to him alone. And that internal struggle was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, heavy, the kind of grief children carry silently because they do not yet know how to defend it aloud. This is how children mourn: through attachment, through refusal, through the instinct to hold on to names because names keep people alive. For George, saying grandma to someone else felt like letting go in a way he wasn't ready for. Like agreeing that remembrance could be softened, diluted, moved aside. And that was a step he could not take, no matter how gently it was suggested. But grief alone didn't explain the firmness of his refusal. Something else had unsettled him. Children hear more than adults think. They absorb tone, pauses, and words spoken behind doors believed to be closed. At some point, Prince George overheard conversations that reshaped how he saw the family dynamic, conversations about hierarchy, resentment, and who truly belonged at the emotional center of the monarchy. And once those words settled in his mind, the title grandma no longer felt natural. It felt forced. It began subtly, in moments no one thought to guard. A door not fully shut. A conversation lowered, not silenced. Adults assuming discretion was enough. But for a child already attuned to emotional shifts, these fragments carried weight. George didn't need full context to sense disagreement. He heard hesitation wrapped in politeness, irritation disguised as protocol. He noticed when voices hardened around certain topics and softened around others. And slowly, he began mapping the emotional fault lines that adults pretended did not exist. The danger of those unguarded conversations wasn't in what was said outright, but in what they revealed unintentionally. A sigh after a name was mentioned. A pause before agreement. A careful rephrasing that suggested compromise rather than conviction. To George, these moments signaled that not everyone felt the same way, even if they were expected to act as though they did. The idea of family unity, once simple, began to fracture into layers of performance and restraint. What unsettled him most were the conflicting attitudes he sensed toward Camilla. In some rooms, her presence was treated as a settled fact, beyond discussion. In others, it was acknowledged with visible effort, respect without warmth. George didn't hear cruelty, he heard discomfort. And children are particularly sensitive to discomfort because it disrupts their sense of emotional safety. When affection feels negotiated rather than natural, trust quietly erodes. Over time, these overheard tensions reshaped how George understood relationships. He stopped seeing them as fixed and dependable. Instead, he recognized them as conditional, influenced by rank, history, and unresolved feeling. This realization marked a turning point. The monarchy was no longer just a family to him, it was a system. And systems, he learned, could ask people to behave in ways that didn't align with what they felt. As this understanding deepened, George grew more reserved. Not withdrawn, but cautious. His politeness sharpened into distance. His composure became a form of self-protection. He mirrored the emotional restraint he observed, believing that was what was required to navigate the complexity around him. To adults, this appeared as maturity. To George, it was survival. The most damaging effect was how easily emotional distance became normalized. Tension was masked as courtesy. Silence was framed as respect. And George learned that discomfort didn't need to be resolved, it only needed to be managed. But children cannot manage emotional contradictions indefinitely. Eventually, they choose clarity over convenience. They choose honesty over harmony. This was the moment George stopped believing that relationships were simple or interchangeable. He understood that words carried histories, that titles carried expectations, and that using them carelessly could betray something deeper. The title grandma, once associated with warmth and constancy, now felt entangled with expectation and imbalance. Saying it would mean ignoring everything he had sensed but never been allowed to question. Still, the most heartbreaking influence came not from what George heard, but from who he watched suffer in silence. Catherine never spoke ill. She never vented. She never let emotion spill where it didn't belong. But children sense what parents hide. Prince George watched his mother navigate an impossible balance: respect without warmth, duty without comfort. And over time, he began associating the word grandma not with love, but with emotional restraint and quiet sacrifice. That realization changed everything. From the outside, Catherine's composure appeared unshakable. She smiled when expected. She spoke carefully. She honored every role with precision. But beneath that calm lived a constant negotiation: how much to give, how much to withhold, how to remain gracious while protecting something deeply personal. George noticed the difference between her public steadiness and the subtle heaviness that followed certain encounters. Children don't need explanations to recognize strain, they read it in pauses, in breath held too long, in the way a room feels after someone leaves. George was especially sensitive to those shifts. He watched how his mother's energy changed depending on who was present, how her posture tightened, how her voice softened into formality rather than ease. None of this was dramatic. That was the problem. It was so restrained that it became normalized. And in that normalization, George began to learn a quiet lesson about emotional boundaries where warmth was allowed, and where it had to be rationed. Children mirror what they see. They internalize not just behavior but emotional rules. George learned that respect could exist without closeness, that politeness could replace affection, that doing the right thing didn't always feel right. He watched his mother model strength through restraint, grace through silence. And while that strength impressed him, it also unsettled him. Because love to a child is supposed to feel safe, not measured. The distinction between respect and affection became clearer with time. Respect was consistent, predictable, expected. Affection was rare, unspoken, carefully managed. George began to associate the word grandma not with comfort or spontaneity, but with the kind of emotional discipline he saw his mother practice daily. It wasn't that Catherine expressed pain openly, she didn't. It was that she carried it quietly, and George felt it without being told. Those silent lessons shaped his understanding of family. He learned that some relationships required endurance rather than ease. That sacrifice could be invisible and still real. And that sometimes the absence of warmth spoke louder than any conflict ever could. For George, this wasn't about choosing sides. It was about protecting an emotional truth he had come to understand through observation, not instruction. As time passed, the word grandma grew heavier. It felt loaded with expectation rather than connection. Saying it would mean accepting the emotional distance he had watched his mother endure so gracefully. It would mean participating in a dynamic that asked for compliance, not closeness. And George, quietly but firmly, decided he could not do that. By the time the palace tried to formalize affection, George had already reached his conclusion. The monarchy runs on protocol. Titles are assigned. Roles are reinforced. Affection is curated. But Prince George did something radical. He responded emotionally instead of institutionally. His refusal wasn't loud. It wasn't disrespectful. It was calm, deliberate, and devastating. In that moment, a child reminded the palace that love cannot be scheduled, assigned, or inherited by decree. For generations, the institution has relied on a delicate illusion that emotional language can be standardized the same way ceremony is. Words are not just words inside the monarchy, they are signals. They affirm order. They reinforce legitimacy. They smooth uncomfortable transitions. And grandma in this context was never just familial. It was strategic. It was meant to normalize, to settle, to quietly seal a chapter the palace wanted closed. What no one anticipated was that the person least bound by protocol would be the one to refuse it. Prince George's response exposed a vulnerability the institution prefers to keep hidden. The palace is comfortable managing behavior. It is far less comfortable confronting emotional autonomy, because autonomy cannot be corrected without consequence. To force affection would reveal its absence. To insist on a title would expose the fragility beneath it. And so, George's refusal created a standoff no one could openly acknowledge between obedience and authenticity. What gave the moment its power was its simplicity. There was no argument to counter, no misstep to reframe. George had not broken a rule. He had declined an emotional assignment. And in doing so, he reminded everyone present that respect can be taught, but love cannot. That truth landed heavily in a system designed to blur the difference whenever necessary. The symbolic weight of the refusal was impossible to ignore. This was the future king quietly asserting an inner boundary, not through defiance, but through sincerity. And that distinction mattered, because it suggested something unsettling, that future authority might be guided less by tradition and more by conscience, less by expectation and more by feeling. For an institution built on continuity, that possibility was deeply uncomfortable. Senior figures understood immediately what this meant. If George could resist emotional scripting now, what might he resist later? If he could choose truth over convenience as a child, what would happen when he faced far greater pressures as an adult? The refusal wasn't just personal. It was precedent-setting. It hinted at a generation that might no longer confuse harmony with silence. What followed was not confrontation, but calculation. A careful reassessment of how much influence still existed over the narrative being shaped around him. The fear was not that George had been disrespectful, it was that he had been sincere. Sincerity cannot be managed the way appearances can. And once it appears, it invites questions no institution likes to answer. This was how a child disrupted decades of carefully maintained tradition, not by challenging authority outright, but by quietly refusing to perform an emotion he did not feel. In that refusal lived a moral clarity that unsettled everyone who witnessed it, because it forced a reckoning with how much of royal unity is real and how much is simply rehearsed. And when word of the refusal quietly spread, reactions inside the family revealed far more than anyone expected. No official statement was made, no correction issued. But behind closed doors, concern turned into alarm. Advisors debated optics. Senior figures questioned influence. Some saw a problem to fix. Others saw a warning. Because if the future king was already resisting emotional scripting, what else might he one day refuse? What unfolded next was not chaos, but calculation. The palace does not panic publicly, it strategizes privately. Calm voices filled rooms where unease sat heavily beneath polished language. The refusal was dissected not as a child's emotion, but as a symbolic event. What did it signal? Who might interpret it? How far could it travel if mishandled? The response was measured, but the tension was unmistakable. Everyone understood that this was not about a single word, it was about control. Fear surfaced quietly, dressed as caution. Precedent is the monarchy's greatest anxiety, and George's refusal felt dangerously close to one. If emotional autonomy was allowed here, where did it stop? Titles had always been tools to stabilize transition, to soften perception, to reassure continuity. But this moment suggested that continuity could no longer be assumed through compliance alone. That unsettled long-held assumptions about influence and inheritance. Opinions quickly divided. Some advisors urged intervention, gentle correction, subtle reinforcement, a reminder of expectation. Others warned against it. Forcing the issue, they argued, would risk something far worse than silence. It would expose the machinery behind the message. It would confirm that affection was being managed rather than felt. And once that illusion cracked, repairing it would be impossible. At the heart of the debate was a truth the institution struggles to confront. Emotional authenticity cannot be engineered. The monarchy has survived by mastering appearances, not feelings. But this generation was different. George had grown up in a world that questioned narratives, that valued sincerity over symbolism. His refusal wasn't a threat because it was disobedient, it was a threat because it was honest. Long-term planning suddenly felt fragile. Carefully crafted future narratives relied on predictability, on heirs who followed emotional scripts as faithfully as ceremonial ones. George's behavior hinted at a shift that no briefing paper could contain. A future king guided by internal conviction rather than expectation would change the institution in ways no one could yet define. That possibility lingered uncomfortably in every strategic conversation that followed. What unsettled senior figures most was how quietly this change had arrived. There was no rebellion to suppress, no scandal to outrun, just a child who had chosen truth over convenience. That kind of challenge offered no easy response. You could not discipline it without appearing cruel. You could not ignore it without appearing weak. And so, the palace did what it often does in moments of uncertainty: it waited. But waiting did not bring clarity. It only deepened the sense that something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer about optics or influence alone. It was about whether the monarchy could adapt to a future shaped by emotional honesty rather than inherited expectation. And that question remained unresolved, hanging quietly over every discussion, every plan, every carefully rehearsed vision of what lay ahead. Yet none of them fully understood the depth of George's reasoning until one final truth surfaced. When Prince George finally explained quietly, privately, why he wouldn't say the word, the room didn't argue. It didn't correct him. It fell apart. Because his reason wasn't political. It wasn't rebellious. It was painfully simple. He said he already had a grandmother. And calling someone else by that name felt like letting her disappear. There was no speech, no dramatic declaration. Just a child choosing honesty when silence was no longer enough. His voice didn't shake, but the words landed with a weight no adult in the room had prepared for. Because there was nothing to counter. No rulebook could override grief. No protocol could soften what he was saying. In that moment, George wasn't refusing a title, he was protecting a bond. His explanation stripped the situation down to its core. He didn't speak of loyalty to people still living, or resentment toward those asking him to comply. He spoke of memory, of permanence, of the fear that naming someone else grandma would quietly erase the woman he still carried with him. For George, names were anchors. They held people in place, and once released, they could drift away forever. That innocence was devastating. It revealed how deeply he had internalized loss, and how carefully he had guarded it. Children don't process grief through logic, they process it through loyalty, through rituals, through refusal. George wasn't clinging to the past out of stubbornness. He was holding on because letting go felt like betrayal of love, of memory, of the emotional truth he had built his world around. The adults listening understood then how badly they had underestimated him. They had assumed his resistance was confusion, or discomfort, or the result of influence. What they heard instead was clarity, emotional clarity far beyond his years. He had not been avoiding the word because he didn't understand its importance. He avoided it because he understood it too well. Silence followed, not the awkward kind, but the kind that settles when something true has been said. Protocol evaporated in that space. No one rushed to reassure. No one offered a correction, because to do so would have been to argue with grief itself. The structure that usually dictated response had nothing to offer here. Titles, roles, expectations, all of it felt suddenly irrelevant. What remained was a realization no one wanted to confront. That a child had articulated what the institution could not. That love does not adapt on command. That remembrance is not transferable. And that the future of the monarchy was being shaped not just by strategy or tradition, but by the emotional integrity of the child who would one day inherit it. In that quiet reckoning, something irreversible occurred. The monarchy was forced to sit with the truth George had voiced, one that exposed the limits of control and the cost of ignoring emotional reality. Because if the future king was already choosing memory over mandate, sincerity over symbolism, then the path ahead would not be as predictable as anyone had planned. And in that silence, the monarchy was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about its future. Prince George didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge authority. He simply stayed true to his heart. And in doing so, he revealed something profound. The future of the monarchy may not be louder, but it will be more honest. If a child can resist emotional rewriting now, what kind of king will he become when duty and conscience collide? What made this moment quietly revolutionary was its restraint. There was no confrontation to condemn, no rebellion to suppress, just a calm decision rooted in feeling rather than fear. Emotional autonomy, especially within the monarchy, has always been rare. Feelings are expected to follow structure, not precede it. Yet George's refusal suggested a shift already underway, one where inner truth is no longer automatically surrendered to outer expectation. That alone carried symbolic weight far beyond his age. For centuries, the institution has survived by teaching heirs how to absorb pressure without showing it. Strength was defined as endurance. Unity was defined as silence. But this moment hinted at a different definition of strength, one grounded in empathy, rather than image management. George didn't reject tradition outright. He reframed it. He showed that continuity does not require emotional compromise, and that honoring the past does not mean erasing personal truth. This is how evolution begins in institutions built on permanence, not through collapse, but through quiet recalibration. George's choice signaled that the next generation may lead differently, not by rejecting ceremony, but by humanizing it. Not by discarding legacy, but by grounding it in feeling. A monarchy shaped by empathy would not be weaker. It would be more resilient, because it would be rooted in authenticity rather than performance. That is why this moment may echo far beyond childhood. Decades from now, when historians search for signs of change, they may return to this quiet refusal. Not as scandal, not as defiance, but as the first visible crack in an emotional architecture that had gone unquestioned for generations. A reminder that even the most powerful institutions are shaped, eventually, by the emotional integrity of those who inherit them. Emotional truth is not loud. It does not demand attention. It waits. And when it finally speaks, it does so with a clarity that cannot be dismissed. George's decision did not disrupt the monarchy overnight, but it planted something lasting, an expectation that future leadership might value sincerity over symbolism, feeling over fade. That expectation, once formed, is impossible to reverse. What began as a child protecting a memory became something much larger, the beginning of a different royal legacy, one where power is tempered by empathy, where tradition is carried forward without silencing the heart, and where the future king is not defined solely by what he inherits, but by what he chooses to honor. Because sometimes, the smallest voices force the largest institutions to finally listen. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.